So this is the final video where we're going to focus in on connecting your topic to a particular theory. And you know that we've been through all of these stages so far in previous videos, and we are um, going over a series of ideas that can be related to the idea that media, through various storytelling practices, actively create understandings of social reality, what social reality is, and why social reality takes the form that it does. And the idea that these ways of looking at the world, that the media create ways of looking at the world that in turn affect how we live in the world, how we think about it, and how we act within it. And we've talked about these things as being related to concepts of ideology. We've been through moral panics. We've been through agenda setting theory, although in most writing, agenda setting theory isn't really connected to the cultural studies exploration of ideology. But I would argue that there are clear aspects of ideology to it, even though they talk about speak in different languages, they're talking about the same thing. And this brings us to the third paradigm that I want to talk about, the third way of theorizing how media affect the world through the stories that it tells, and that's cultivation theory. And cultivation theory was a body of research that emerged from a team of researchers from the University of Pennsylvania, led by George Gerbner. And what they did was they looked at how media shaped television viewers' perceptions of the world. And what they did was two things. They started off by doing content analysis of primetime television in America. And on the basis of their content analysis, they suggested that across a variety of different kinds of programming, broadcast television presented its audiences with the same kinds of ideas and stories again and again and again and again. And these were particularly, they looked at the prevalence of violence, and they looked at the way that that violence was gendered and classed. But really, the violence was just kind of a way of examining. The violence itself was a medium for examining the nature of media power, which Gerbner did think of in ideological terms, and it was that that representations told stories about power, and over a long period of time, told repetitive stories about how the world worked. And through survey analysis, the researchers discovered that the more television people watched, the more likely they were to develop what they called second order political beliefs about the world. And in particular, one of the most important findings was that three things, really. Firstly, that there was a lot more violence on television than there was in the real world. And when you looked at the political opinions of people who watched a lot of television, you tended to find that exposure to television was associated with certain views of the world, particularly related to the concept of fear. Gerbner's essential argument was the main thing that media violence did was it provoked fear. It made people afraid of the social world. It made them overestimate the chances that they would be somehow victimized by other people in society, either by being assaulted or being exploited in some way. And that made people predisposed to authoritarian sorts of politics. People wanted to be protected and didn't much care how that was done. So the idea behind cultivation analysis is that you have a media system that somehow presents you with the same sorts of stories, ideas, and images over and over again, to the point of view where the repetition of these images, ideas, and stories has a naturalizing effect. you come to accept that that's the way the world is, or you come to develop political opinions that are related to the things that you see time and time again. So the important thing here is we would need to establish for a cultivation perspective that there's a particular message system, a media environment that we live in that's repeating that's telling us the same story over and over again. And I suppose one of the things that jumps out of my mind here is the images that we've seen, of course, the great toilet paper crisis of 2020. And one of the things that we've seen over and over again are the sorts of images that you see here about people hoarding toilet paper. And we can think about this as a way that cultivation analysis can be used to explain a particular sort of media effect. Now, one of the arguments that Gerbner put forward, and these arguments are found in a series of studies that were published mostly in the Journal of Communication called the Violence Profiles. And these were published, the most important ones were published from the mid-70s through to the early 1980s. And one of the things that these studies found was that the more television people watched, the more they tended to be suspicious of other people. So some of the political correlates of watching a lot of TV and therefore a lot of TV violence and a lot of TV crime was that people who watched a lot of TV were more likely than relatively light viewers to feel that other people couldn't be trusted, that you couldn't really trust anybody. You couldn't trust politicians or institutions or anybody. Other people, the belief that other people were out for themselves, didn't really care about other people. And overall, one of the dispositions that was associated with heavy television viewing was the idea that the world is a scary place. Now, how can we relate this to the coronavirus and particularly the example of hoarding? Well, if we think about these images of hoarding that we've seen repeated across media, shared widely through social media, then I suppose one of the things we can say is that these things can be related to cultivation theory as enactments, as direct depictions of the idea that people can't be trusted and they're only out for themselves. This is a message that's very much underlined by political leaders talking about the need for people to govern themselves, to behave better, through lockdown procedures, the idea that actually people can't be trusted to act in a socially responsible manner, and the idea that everyone is out for themselves. These images that we see and these stories that we encounter are enactments of the basic lessons of cultivation theory. So that's pretty interesting, because the thing about cultivation theory was that it was developed in relation to broadcast television. So it was developed in relation to a completely different media environment. And for many people, that's raised a lot of questions about how relevant it remains for thinking about a very different media environment, a media environment where people aren't paying attention to the same media sources, because there are many more media sources. An environment where people aren't getting their news from mainstream sources but from social media. An environment where people are being exposed to messages not directly from the media, but through media messages and images that are being shared with them through social media contacts. So a media environment with a very different ecology. So it's really kind of interesting to think that even with all of those changes, this basic argument that one of the features of our media environment is we're still bombarded with messages about selfishness and other people behaving violently and in the name of self-interest in a chaotic media world, and that this somehow reinforces the impression that the world is a scary place. It still works. Now, to make it work, we'd need to go back and read carefully about cultivation theory, and we would need to think carefully about the distinctions between the sort of media systems and message systems that theory analyzed and the sorts of message systems that we live in today. But nevertheless, as a starting point, I think that what we can see is that in relation to the images of hoarding and of people behaving in what we've established is quite irrational manners, we can talk about how this basic idea that what matters most in media is the production of fear through the constant representation of a chaotic world where other people can't be trusted still holds in a way, and at least gives us a particular organized way of explaining how media produce fear in the current environment, and therefore why it's worth thinking about the role that media theory can play in explaining the role that media are playing in society, which, of course, is basically what you need to do in this assignment. You need to persuade a skeptical reader, someone who thinks that media research is kind of a waste of time, that media theory actually helps explain the world that we live in today in a way that improves public discussions about how media affect society.